Hello and welcome back. Max here for part 3 of 3 in this little Lorcana mini saga that we have going on. Just want to stop real quick and thank everyone who has been watching, interacting, commenting. Can't really thank you all enough. It means so much, and we really appreciate and have heard all of your suggestions for future content. So get ready for that coming your way here soon. So jumping into the final section, we are talking about the late game, and I also want to do an overview / update to include a few more new cards, since in our release schedule, it's been a little while since I have hit up this series, so I want to make sure it is as up to date as possible for all of you, which is, as of right now, we're a couple months out from Inklands coming out. About a full month-ish, a little bit more maybe, and I want to make sure that we reflect that in what I'm talking about. So, jumping right into the late game, this is the part of the game where you've put up all the pieces. You've set everything down. The dominoes are all right next to each other in a line, and now you're going to push them over. So, what does pushing them over entail? Well, it depends on what deck you're playing. Obvious, right? Pretty thematic throughout this entire video series here. So let's start out first and foremost with the late game for the aggro deck. All right, so what does the late game look like from the perspective of the aggro deck? Well, I'm going to start here because, quite frankly, it's the shortest talking point of the 3 decks. The aggro deck is looking to probably finish up questing for the last few lore that they need to win the game. Pretty straightforward, right? In the late game context of the aggro matchup, they're probably hoping to land somewhere in about the 14 to 16 lore realm, and then they can begin to close out the game. Now, if we are going back to the first chapter meta, this would be trying to either flood the board with small characters against colors that don't have a sweeper, or against a sweeper, trying to use some of the more higher numbered characters and bodyguards to help protect, to get the last couple lure they need to get over the line. That has since changed in the new meta for Rise of the Floodborn, and now the aggro decks tend to lean on that strategy to a small extent, but much more so the bounce package that Amethyst has presented, and they are looking to play the Merlin Goat, pick it up, put it back down a couple of times, or use Arthur to pick up a small character and put it back down and close out from there. So it's a very straightforward package of enough high-end or high-value pieces left in their hand so that they can execute the last few lore they need off of 1 or 2 of these high-power pieces. And that's kind of what the aggro decks are looking to do. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the control deck late game. This is a little bit more of a following a path to see what you're trying to do, or to kind of finish laying out the pieces you need to finally execute on that game plan, a lot more so than the aggro deck. So what you're trying to do in these controlling decks is figure out how you're going to achieve your lore. The late game might entail simply beginning to get lore, where the aggro decks are looking to gather up the last 3 to 5 lore they need. The control decks might be looking to turn the corner and finally start questing for the first time during the entire game. So they're using cards like Sorcerer's Spellbook. They're using cards like Mini Surfer. They're using cards like the bounce package I described previously in order to quest up, or use the goat to bounce up and down and gain their lore from there. Because they generate so much of an ink and card advantage, they have a lot more options going into the late game, and what they're hoping to do is not only do those pieces, but also be able to maintain control of the board. So using heavy hitters like Lady Tremaine, using other heavy hitters like Blue Hades to be able to keep the board clear of one-off threats from the more aggressive or mid-range decks, while being able to begin to quest themselves uncontested in order to close out the game. So card draw's still going to be great in the late game, right? Your Merlin Rabbits and your Flavisham quests are still going to be very strong in this late game portion of the matchup, but it's also going to be critical that you have the pieces you need in place to close and answer those last couple lingering threats from the opposing deck. Now, obviously, that changes a bit in the mirror, right? Because they're both aiming for the same end game. They're both looking to play these heavy hitter one-for-one answers that quest for a high amount. That's where cards like the Spell Book really start to break serve, because then they can start questing with impunity, right? The red-purple mirror, there is no item breaker, so they're just able to use that spell book through the course of many turns, in addition to like the random, like, oh, I get to quest here, oh, I can quest here for a couple, and really break serve by consistently always being able to quest for one. And that's part of the reason why we've seen an uptick in the later part of the Floodborn meta of Ursula coming in, especially because she's so good at being picked up and put back down, because she's costing the opponent lore while presenting a gigantic threat that can quest for 3. So it really depends on what you're doing and understanding, again, thematic through the whole video series, understanding what you're up against and what you should be holding, what you should be inking, and what you should be playing. And I know, an oversimplification, and I've heard your suggestions, so expect more on the inking front. The late game for Combo is very simple, right? Because it's a similar late game to what Control's doing, except their follow-up is win the game now. So that's a pretty straightforward kind of answer. Obviously in Lorcana there is no like set up a few cards, win the game at once. The closest we get is like Aerial Who's It Collector. But there are some mill decks that are trying to execute their game plan of repeat the mill plan in the late game while controlling the board. Rinse, repeat, I would say, is more the, we have the board locked up, there's not enough threats going on, and we can continue to rinse and repeat our whole new worlds. So not a super complex late game from Combo. It is very, very similar in Lorcana to the way the Control decks play. Now when it comes to mid-range is when it gets harder to explain in a large sense, because you've already now defined your role in the matchup. You're either the beatdown or you're the control style deck, right? You've kind of chosen your path, and depending on what that is, your late game is obviously going to change fairly dramatically. So if you look at a deck like the shift style Steel Song decks, you're either trying to shift down your big threats and control the board, like cards like Cinderella, Stout-Hearted are a good example of this, or you're trying to maybe flood the board with a bunch of small characters that you've drawn off of a whole new world in order to race against the control decks that are trying to leverage a board sweeper to take you out. So maybe you've a whole new world at a couple of times, you see that they're 3B prepareds in the discard pile, so you're like, you know what, the odds of them having the fourth one here are pretty low. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to dump the small characters in my hand. Maybe I've got a Rockstar Stitch, and I'm going to draw my way through these small characters, flood the board, and be able to quest for the last 8 to 9 lore that I need here, hopefully tooting a flute along the way. Or the opposite end of the spectrum could be true, and that you're playing maybe the hyper aggro decks and you're whole new worlding against your better judgment, but you have to find that grab your sword because they're so far ahead in tempo or on the actual board that you need to wipe the field. So you have to find that grab your sword kind of at all costs, and then hopefully along with that grab your sword, maybe a follow-up or a big Tinkerbell, something to wipe out the second wave of characters that the aggro deck's going to play down, and then develop from there. So it's really two very different styles that these mid-range decks can shape, and that's what makes the decks so strong. A lot of reason why more experienced players tend to gravitate towards these mid-range decks, because they're so decision intensive, and you have to really kind of figure out what path you're going to take, right? It's a very much a forked road in the early game, and then in the mid game, you're making sure you shape that destiny the best you can, and then in the late game, trying to execute on it. So the mid-range decks are definitely some of the tougher ones to pilot, in my opinion, in Lorcana, because there's these macro decisions, as well as all the micro sequencing and tiny little ink decisions, things like that, that matter a ton, but are very small individual case type decisions. So it makes the games very, very tricky for mid-range, but the late game is executing on that overall macro game plan that you've elected to go down. So I want to be able to tie the whole room together, right? You've watched this in disparate pieces that have been released over a kind of period of time with breaks in the middle, so you might not be frosty on the whole thing. So I just want to wrap this up for you all and kind of draw some parallels. I think one of the decks that typifies this process the best, or the most obviously, maybe not the best, but in the most obvious fashion, is the red-blue Popsicles deck. So red-blue Popsicles in the early game is trying to land some form of either ramp or interaction, depending on what deck they're playing against. Ramp, if they're playing against control, or a slower, bigger mid-range deck, like the heavier Steel Song decks, or they are trying to find interaction if they're playing against a more aggressive, or some of the small potato-y style mid-range decks. So it really depends. They're either trying to find Grammatala and Teethan ambitions, or they're trying to use Grammatala to one jump ahead and maybe get a couple random lore in there, or challenge a character at a loss so that they can go up in ink. Then in the mid game, which is the most critical for Popsicles, you are trying to set up your Flavisham engine, and you are trying to set up Popsicles, you're trying to set up Fishbone Quills, and whatever other assorted items from there you elect to play. You want to have at least a couple on the field so that when you quest with Hiram, you can go ahead and sacrifice it and draw some cards. And you want to make sure that you have the way to keep doing this, right? This is the engine that makes the deck turn. The reason the deck's so powerful in the late game is because they have a giant grip of cards, and the opponent has very few limited resources they're working on, where the Popsicles deck has like half the deck in their hand. And that's what makes that so strong. So in that mid-game, everything is focused on setting up that Flavisham engine, or being able to get to a point where they can speed up and expedite a be prepared against the more aggressive decks. And then finally, the late game, this deck has the best of the best in terms of haymakers, right? These one-for-ones are ridiculous. They have Lady Tremaine, they have Hades. It's crazy, and it can go as big as into like be prepareds, and it feels so demoralizing because they just seem to always have it, and the reason is because they're holding like a dozen cards in their hand. So this kind of best, I think, illustrates the process of each segment of the game super well. So if you want to really start to understand and unpack it, while I know it's not the best deck in the format, I do recommend getting a couple reps in with Popsicles and just kind of learning how the deck works. And I'm talking about the red-blue specifically, to kind of learn how the deck works, because every part is dependent on the other. And I know the lack of flexibility is what pushes other players to now start pairing Sapphire with other things like Steel, and kind of doing these like real Steel kind of blue Steel decks that destroy the opponent much quicker if they're playing lower end cards, and set them up for the late game, not only with Flavisham, but with a whole new world in case they can't trigger their engine in the mid game, and they don't just flat lose on the spot. They actually have backup plans available to them, or they can rush against the control decks down with their Fishbone Quill, and then whole new world, which is super powerful because of the flexibility that's granted to them in that regard. So there's a lot of really powerful options. They're not tied down strictly to the same early, mid, late style that the red-blue decks are. So I think that just taking that red-blue Popsicles deck for a spin is definitely a good idea, if nothing else than to illustrate how one part of the game serves the other, and it has the most obvious inflection points, I think, of any deck in Lorcana. So that'll do it for this particular video series. Again, thank you all so much for hanging. Really appreciate it. Of course, we're going to have more Lorcana content coming your way. Don't think we're going anywhere. We're having a blast playing it. It's a fun, fun game that is far more well thought out than I was afraid when I initially saw that it was going to be a thing. It's been just a blast seeing the metagame evolve, seeing new cards get played. It's all been very, very exciting, and we're very excited to bring more content your way. Thanks again.